Peter's Principles, Learning to Follow Jesus. Chapter 10, Godliness. Peter's Principles is a study of 2 Peter 1, verses 3 to 8. Simon Peter's mature reflection on how he discovered his new identity in the kingdom of God. The premise of this study is that alongside other important matters, discipleship should include this training in how to discover our new identity in Christ's character and love. Christ's character and love are the themes of 7 ordered qualities which we must add to saving faith. Peter says that God promises us power to attain the human nature he intended for us, a nature perfectly demonstrated in Jesus Christ. Faith in the gospel of Christ links us to God's power of salvation. But that faith does not immediately or automatically change how we feel or think or act. It does, however, provide the base upon which we can build virtuous motives, accurate knowledge, and self-control. Diligently building those qualities on our faith results in the steadfastness of a new lifestyle. And practicing these qualities over and over builds a Christ-like character. Christ-like character is what builds Christ-like relationships. That is a key insight into spiritual growth that we're going to begin to examine today. And the fundamental relationship supporting all the others is our redeemed relationship with God. Godliness translates the Greek word eusebia. Eusebia expresses a lifestyle that lives in reverence to God or in the presence of God, that is submissive to God. A lifestyle, in fact, that is lived as worship to God. Now, unlike virtue, knowledge, self-control, and steadfastness, which basically have to do with the general vitality of my inner character, godliness describes my character as it wraps around God as a person. It's the Greek word that typically translates the Old Testament phrase, fear of God. Now, the fear of God sounds strange to modern ears. People think it might refer to being afraid of God, and that's not entirely true. The fear of God describes a realistic awareness of the living God himself. The idols we create to replace God are disappointing fabrications of our own minds. The living God is awesome. Awesome, not in the modern sense of cool, but in the sense of being overwhelmed. The living God is overwhelming. There's a sense in which the living God is threatening just because of how grand and huge he is. I mean, the way a mountain or a volcano or a whale or an aircraft carrier sitting in the harbor seems overwhelming. I mean, the living God is big. There are no limits that you can place around him. He does whatever he pleases, period. So, I guess for those without a personal and positive relationship with him, that bigness truly is fearful in the sense of terror. But for those who have been invited to know him as a friend, his bigness is invigorating, thrilling even. The key to understanding godliness is seen in how the fear of God relates to loving God. Deuteronomy 10. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. The Greek word eusebia, godliness, translates the Hebrew phrase fear of God in Deuteronomy 10. Now look at all the equivalent ways that this idea is expressed. Fearing God is like walking in his ways, which means obeying his law. It's like serving God with all of one's heart and soul. And here's the big one, fearing God is what it means to love him. This never feels intuitive or quite right to the modern Western mind, because we're taught from childhood that love is a close, happy, maybe passionate or compassionate feeling, but always an optional one. But in the Bible, love for God is linked to obedience, and therefore it is not optional. It's not just a feeling that we could or maybe could choose not to have. Loving God is about seeing Him as so big and so awesome and so wonderful that He frames everything else in life. Nothing in all reality can ever be bigger or more important than He is. So godliness is a lifestyle that reveres God as He truly is. It's how we love God. With godliness, character transitions into relationships. Character builds all of a disciple's relationships, but the most fundamental relationship is with the living God, not with a religion or theology, although we need those things to understand Him, but a relationship with the person who made us and redeemed us. Godliness describes the only possible way to properly relate to the living God, and it's by shaping our life, our lifestyle around Him. You could say that Peter learned more of who God is every day with Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh, the perfect image of God. Jesus is the most we can ever know of the person of God. We know who God is through Jesus. One day, every believer will have the same likeness of God that Jesus had because we're going to be like Him. But until then, Jesus is the only perfect reflection of God's character in human form. Peter developed a relationship with God by getting to know and follow Jesus. In the book, I camped on two experiences that happened within a week, and together they illustrated the breadth of Jesus' nature, and Peter would have to reshape his life to stretch between both of them. The first happened on the trip north to Mount Hermon. Jesus took Peter, James, and John with Him up a mountain, and something happened. You know, when God seems to localize His presence, it's called a theophany. People realize they are in the presence of God, and that's what happened on the mountain. But this theophany was different than any other, because it wasn't that Jesus, Peter, James, and John saw a theophany. Jesus was the theophany. What a way to say that Jesus is God in the flesh. His flesh did not disappear, but He shined like the sun. God reveals Himself in the universe He created, but we can't relate to His mountains and birds and stars in a personal way. By becoming a theophany, Peter began to relate to the Creator as a person. The infinite Creator is the same person he was following as a disciple. To see Jesus is to see the magnificent, the majestic character of God in human form. Then something else happened when they returned from the trip, and it was as touching as the Transfiguration was inspiring. Fresh from the most awe-inspiring experience he ever had, he runs into a local tax collector, collecting the 2 drachma per person temple tax, a tax that supported the temple. Knowing that Jesus lived with Simon, he asked if his master paid the tax. And he asked that because rabbis were exempt. So was Jesus claiming to be a rabbi? Well, that was an embarrassing question for Peter. Peter treated Jesus as a rabbi, but Jesus hadn't had any customary training as a rabbi, and the leading rabbis questioned his credentials. If you were Peter, how would you feel? Are you kidding me? This guy wants Jesus to pay a tax on his own temple? But Peter had been forbidden by Jesus to say anything about the Transfiguration. Peter must have been frustrated and depressed, ready to explode. In the end, he had to say, yes, he did pay it. And that felt just humiliating. Peter didn't know that Jesus was listening from inside the doorway. And we know that because of what happened next. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Oh, then the sons are free." We should appreciate the significance of Jesus speaking first. He was listening. He understood. He cared. And he took the initiative to address Peter's internal frustration. Peter, you understand correctly. I don't need to pay the tax. Must have been hard for you to obey my command not to say more. We will pay, because we don't want to stir up trouble. But, and I can almost see Jesus put his arm on Peter's shoulder and draw him close, as the text goes on to finish the conversation. Peter, this is how we're going to pay it. Remember the day I called you in the boat, when you felt a miracle happening in your hands with the fish? Let's do it again, just for fun. Go catch a fish, any fish, and pay with the money you find in it. Can you imagine how Peter felt, catching that fish and paying the tax with this coin, secretly knowing where it came from? They had the money. There was no reason for Jesus to do this except that he cared about Peter and Peter's heart, and he wanted to encourage him. That week, Peter learned to relate to God on a huge emotional spectrum, running across two very different poles. For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, and to revive the heart of the contrite. Because we find the person of God in Jesus, we can relate to him in his transcendent presence and in his intimate presence. Peter learned to love God by loving the one who revealed God in the world, in all his glory and in all his affectionate care. Over time, Simon built his own character around Jesus. As Peter, he earned a cherished reputation for powerful preaching and tender healing, all while he was rebuilding his identity around Jesus Christ. As I shared my own story, I mentioned how I have attempted to reshape my life around God and therefore love him, and to do so consciously by taking heed to the many roles he uses to illustrate our relationship. They are each somewhere on the infinite to intimate scale. I tend to use the role of Father almost all the time. It's most familiar. It's a favorite of Jesus. I also use Lord, but that's more likely to just be a word I use because I have no experience living under royalty or under kings. My first discovery of this involved thinking of God not as Lord, but as boss. Ephesians 6 tells us to pursue our careers as people who work for Jesus. Well, that didn't exhaust the meaning of Lord, but it made part of it very real to me. I had experience working for bosses. I could learn something about relating to God by how to properly relate to the administrator of the Computer Tax Division of the state of Maryland in Annapolis, the manager of Bailey's Ice Cream Parlor in Harvard Yard, Massachusetts, the janitors who had more seniority than me at Boston Lying-In Hospital, and the chief of security at a Raytheon plant. Every boss I had either represented something about God or violated something about God, but either way, I could use the experience to relate to God better and learn to obey him and honor him and serve God better, which is to say, love God better. I discovered that there are a multitude of roles that combine various aspects of God's transcendent power over me and intimacy in caring for me. And I can use my experience with those roles to get a better feel for my many-faceted relationship with God. And with each role, I get to use the character-building tools that Peter mentioned to reshape my life around God. To get a flavor of how roles can enrich our relationship with God, try this. Confess the same sin to God using the context of 5 different roles. Godliness rebuilds life around who I discover God to be in Jesus. Developing godliness is how we learn to love God. Loving God is equivalent to fearing Him. And that's exactly what Jesus said. To love Him and to love God the Father means to keep His words. It means to adjust, to modify the way we live, to rebuild our lives around God's true nature. I love God when willingly and from the heart I change how I think and speak about God. I change my worship practices and how I use the Sabbath. I change how I spend my money. I change how I approach sex. I change how I do things at work. I change how I speak to and serve members of my family. All the things in the Ten Commandments, and in fact anything in God's law. I love God when I do any of these things in the presence of God Himself, realizing that He is there and always relating first to Him. This whole thing sounds strange to us because we don't understand love that way. In a society that associates love only with positive feelings, Christians typically confuse the wonderful feelings that accompany saving faith with loving God. But basic, fundamental saving faith is not about loving God. It's about God loving us. We don't yet have the Christ-like character to love God very well, not at first. But that's okay. Our inability to love God is why Jesus came to save us. We think that we are loving God here when we're enjoying our saving faith, when we are emotionally open to Him in worship, and when we experience gratitude and praise and adoration. Those feelings are genuine, and they're exactly the first things we need in order to grow. But those feelings are not what the Bible calls love. Not yet. So when we got that wrong, we try to jump from worship to love our neighbor and bear fruit from our witness all at once. And we find that the fruit is real, but it's severely limited. Sin has inhibited Christ-like love within believers. We have to learn how to love. And that requires change. It requires new desires, new understanding, and new obedience. Love is a lifestyle of digging out the old self-centered identity that died on the cross with Jesus. That journey begins with saving faith as God unleashes His power to love Him back. But we must keep adding to our faith if we're to experience that power, and it is to bear fruit. Simply put, faith cannot leap to unselfishly love others without changing us first. These are the tools to build character. Character is what we use to build relationships. And the relationships of life are most effectively built when we focus first on God. Which is to say, the most effective projects we can work on are always adapting our lifestyle around the living God, around who He is, around His character and His plans and His will. That is godliness. And looking ahead, we note that the power to love our spiritual and eternal family, the church, brotherly affection, that rests on our developing love for God, and our love for people, all people, our ministry to them, rests on our developing love for all the church. And it is this love that expands God's kingdom in others. And it does so with God's power. Next time, we'll move on from godliness to chapter 11 and brotherly affection. Until then, God bless.